All right, welcome back, everybody. I think we're starting on time, so cool. All right, Loi's not here, so we've got Kitty running the media or running the streaming right now. So, yeah, if anything goes wrong, you can blame her. Um, but yeah, anyone watching online, you can. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. No, Kitty is. I set it up, so it's my fault if anything goes wrong. Kitty's back there watching, so if you type anything in the chat box, she can alert me to that. So anyone watching live, you can still participate as usual. All right, so we are still on Article 23. I'm guessing we'll finish up Article 23 and get into Apology 23, and that's when we'll really deal with Rome's arguments for enforced celibacy. But we're still in the article itself, just kind of making the case directly. Just this is why we think it's fine for our clergy to be married. Then again, Rome will respond in the confutation, then we respond to that in the apology, and that's when stuff will get really fun. So last week we finished off talking about 1 Corinthians 7, 6 through 8. Again, this is one of the verses that advocates for celibacy. This is where Paul is saying, if you can remain single like I am, go ahead. That's probably better. You can better serve the ministry in that way. So that's one of the proof texts that Rome will use for their argument of enforcing celibacy. But again, we're making the point, in that section, Paul is saying it's better to be married than to be aflame with passion. So if you are not wired for celibacy the way that Paul apparently was, it's better for you to be married than to force yourself into what the writers call an unnatural celibacy in an attempt to make yourself better or holier, because that just ends up leading to all sorts of troubles like what was happening in the medieval ages, what's happening today, and all of that. So now we're going to make the case next that marriage is from God. So you can't make this argument that the married state is somehow bad or wrong, because marriage comes from God. God institutes marriage within the act of creation, going all the way back to the start of the Bible in Genesis 1:27. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And again, when you read into Genesis 2, you see that God created the female to be the partner to the male. They are created to be joined together. Let me find the right verse. There 2:24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. This is the verse that Jesus quotes when he's asked about divorce and marriage in Matthew 19, I think that is. So again, this is Genesis 2. The fall isn't until Genesis 3. So even before the fall, marriage was a thing. The very first man God creates, he doesn't say, okay, now remain single forever so that you can be more holy for me. He says, here's a wife for you. Get married. Marriage is a good thing. So God institutes marriage in creation. He upholds it with the sixth commandment, you shall not commit adultery, because adultery is doing married things outside of marriage. And so in giving us the sixth commandment, God is also protecting the institute of marriage. He's saying do these things within marriage. And that's the language you get in the book of Hebrews, calling upon us to keep the marriage bed undefiled, which is not to say don't ever have a marriage bed, but it's saying have a marriage bed and treat it with the respect it deserves, because again, marriage is from God. It's a gift from God. Let's not throw it under the bus. We all know Jesus' first miracle, according to the Gospel of John, happens at the wedding of Cana. And his first miracle is not to smite the bride and groom for getting married, it's to provide wine for them to further celebrate the marriage. So we see throughout the Bible, whenever marriage is mentioned, marriage itself is seen as a good thing. It's the law of God, the way that the world has been set up to run is for men and women to get married and then form a family unit so you can have the father and mother together for the raising of the children and all of the other things that come along with marriage. So marriage is a law of God. And God's law cannot be changed or overruled by any man-made vow, and thus the unnatural vow of celibacy cannot be a binding vow because it is it's 98% of the time it ends up being a vow against God's word, and God's word has to override any other man-made tradition or vow that runs over it. So again, this is our argument against the enforced celibacy of the priest. It's an unnatural celibacy. Most people are not wired for it, and so they're trying to go outside of how God has created them to be in this attempt to set themselves up on a higher pedestal and think that they can make themselves better in the eyes of God by their own man-made traditions, ignoring everything about marriage that God has ordained so far. Is that argument making sense? That's kind of the core argument that we're going to keep coming back to, just looking at it in different ways. All right. So then again, we make the case history is on our side. Lutherans are not starting anything new. Again, we're trying to get back to a time before Rome starts adding a bunch of extra stuff to everything. So this whole idea of priestly celibacy is entirely an invention of Rome. It's not even biblical, because if we look to what we call the pastoral epistles, these are the last writings from Paul that you get in your Bible when Paul is getting older and he's giving instructions to the church. Timothy and Titus is kind of under disciples. He's giving them instructions on what they should look for in pastors, and he's teaching them how to be pastors. And First Timothy gives you kind of the instructions on what to look for in a person that you're considering to make a pastor. And First Timothy 3:2, in giving us the qualifications for overseers, that's the heading, but the qualifications you should look for in someone hoping to be a pastor. Verse 2, therefore an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, etc., etc., etc. So in the list of qualifications there is husband of one wife, not husband to none, not celibate for life, but husband to one wife. I have heard people take this to like the extreme where he'd say like pastors can't be a pastor unless they're married. I wouldn't take it that far, because again, we do have the 1 Corinthians 7 verse where, yeah, for the sake of the ministry, if you can remain single, that's better. But we have in this list of qualifications for pastors, husband of one wife. So you can't say that being married disqualifies you from the pastoral office. To multiple marriage, then it becomes an issue. But husband of one wife, that is still within the realm of above reproach that Paul calls for pastors. Likewise, in the next chapter, and we've talked about this a couple of times already, and we'll talk about it a couple of times in the future, but 1 Timothy 4, Paul writes, now the Spirit expressly says that in later times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons, through the insincerity of liars whose consciences are seared, who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God creates to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. So 1 Timothy 4 says that those who try to forbid marriage are following a doctrine of demons rather than a doctrine of God. And what is Rome doing for all of its clergy right now? Not a place you want to be within. Interestingly enough, and this is something my vicarage supervisor would always point out, if you want to get really broadly speaking the categorizations of stuff, Lutherans are very Pauline in our theology. We really like Paul's epistles. We really like his explanations of law and gospel within Romans and Galatians especially. We're very Paul-centered, whereas Rome is going to be more Petrine, following Peter in their theology, because again, their whole claim to fame is that Jesus supposedly establishes the entire church upon Peter and his descendants, and they have their special authority, so whatever they say goes, regardless of any other source. And that's interesting because, as we saw in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul is single. Peter was married. If we look to Luke 4:38, it says, and Jesus arose and left the synagogue and entered Simon's house, Simon Peter. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was ill with a high fever, and they appealed to him on her behalf. How do you get a mother-in-law? You have to be married for that. So Peter, first pope, was married. You maybe have the argument that his wife was dead by the time he becomes an apostle or something. There's no indication that he was widowed. But he was married, and now Rome is saying, oh, no, if you want to be holy, you can't ever get married. And it's just first pope right there. So that's interesting. Getting outside of the Bible and then into church history and Rome's tradition, Pope Pius II, who lived, his dates are 1405 through 1464, that he's quoted as saying, there may be reasons for clerical celibacy, but there are greater reasons to allow the clergy to marry. So you've got popes in history who weren't such big fans of enforced celibacy for the clergy. St. Cyprian, likewise, said that if one could not maintain a vow of celibacy, then they ought to get married. So again, that's always one of the big attacks that Roman apologists make against Luther is, oh, Luther was too weak. Well, I've seen people say, like, Luther is burning in hell because he broke his vow of celibacy. Whereas St. Cyprian, who, he's a church father, he has as much authority as anyone should have of the Roman church. He said, if you can't maintain your vow of celibacy, then it's better to get married, which Luther did. When he broke his vow of celibacy, it's because he got married to Catherine von Bora. It was within the confines of marriage that he did anything, whereas, again, you've got all these Roman priests who they remain unmarried so they can put on this veneer of celibacy, and then they have their whole slew of mistresses and secret families that they just won't marry and make legitimate because being celibate is somehow better, even though they're not even being celibate. So that's weird. And then finally, Pope Gregory VI had a decree that leniency should be given to those who vowed celibacy in the ignorance of youth. And again, this is where Luther would fall in. He becomes a monk at a fairly young age. Most of the nuns that he's getting out of the convents, these were girls who kind of were sent to the nunnery just because the family didn't have any better prospects for them. So they were kind of coerced into this vow of celibacy in the first place. And even then, it was like they were young and they're like, yeah, so no, this will be fine. I haven't done things yet. How hard could the next 50 years of not doing things be? It's fine. And then like, I kind of want to do things, but I can't because I took this vow when I was younger and I didn't realize how hard it's going to be. So Pope Gregory VI is saying, yeah, if people are in this situation, like they didn't really know what they were getting into, we should be a little bit lenient and maybe like give them a break and let them get married rather than force them into this decision they made when they were 14. Just again, that's what Luther did, but now you have all these Roman apologists and like, oh, how could Luther do such a thing? He's a terrible person. He broke the church because celibacy was too hard for him. And again, like I said last week, he didn't even really want to get married in the first place. He had spent such a long time as a monk. He was like, I'm not really sure I want to get married. And everyone else is like, Luther, you're having all the other monks and priests get married. You should, monks and priests and nuns get married. You should get married too, as an example for everyone. And Luther was like, I don't know. I'm kind of busy. Rome's trying to kill me. I don't want to get married just to make my wife into a widow whenever the Pope catches me and cuts off my head. It wasn't until Catherine comes up, who, again, forced into a convent at a young age because her family didn't really have any other prospects for her. And she's like, well, if I'm going to get married, I'm marrying that one. So she kind of forced Luther's hand. And again, they get married. And then Luther's like, marriage is great. I'm going to write books about how awesome it is to be married and be a father. And this is the best thing ever. Why would Rome want to deny this to anyone? So yeah. So that Roman argument is really a terrible one, but never let facts get in the way of a narrative. And then I have a quote here, quote directly from the article. Thus, that priests and clergy may marry is based on the divine word and command. Moreover, the historical accounts demonstrate that priests were married and that the vow of celibacy has caused so much awful unchristian offense, so much adultery, such terrible unprecedented immorality and abominable vice that even some of the sincere cathedral clergy and also some courtiers in Rome have often confessed and complained how such abominable and overwhelming vice in the clergy would arouse the wrath of God. It is therefore quite deplorable that Christian marriage has not only been prohibited, but also most swiftly punished in many places, as if it were a great crime. So even as this debate is happening, you've got people within the Roman Church who are being like, maybe we shouldn't be forcing celibacy on everyone. It seems to be doing more harm than good. But Rome won't budge because, again, if Rome budges on this, because they've made it an official decree, even though they don't have great argumentation behind it, Rome can't budge on it without admitting that they were wrong about something, and their whole theology is built up on this idea that they're never wrong about anything. And so this is the wonderful can of worms that they've gotten themselves into. But yeah, again, church history, marriage has always been applauded. There's been no prohibition against marriage for the clergy until Rome invents it. So this idea of forced celibacy is the new novel doctrine here. So looking at it historically, and this is a very rough timeline that the article lays out, but it seems to be, early in the church, priests are married. That's fine. 1 Timothy 3, husband and one wife, as long as you're not a serial marrier, you're okay. Then over time, they took that husband of one wife even more seriously than they did before. So the husband of one wife, like historically in the church, that has been usually been applied to issues of divorce, because again, you have Jesus talking about adultery. Whoever puts his wife aside and divorces her and marries another commits adultery. So they'd say if you're a priest who has divorced a woman, you can't get remarried because now you're in a way a husband of two wives. So that was right out. But if your wife died, obviously, that was the sermon text a couple weeks ago. If your wife dies, you're no longer bound in marriage to her. So if you become a widower, then you can remarry, and you're still only considered the husband of one wife. So that was fine. But then the church kind of goes like, well, for clergy, we're going to be a little bit stricter than that. So you can be a married priest, but if your wife dies, then you're out of luck. You can't get remarried, even in the case of becoming a widow. So it starts with very literal, only husband of one wife ever. If your wife's a widow, sorry for your loss, you can't get remarried if you're a priest. And then it shifts into this idea where you can't get married after you're ordained. So celibacy becomes part of the ordination vows if you're not already married. So you can be a married man and then become a priest, and that's fine. But once you become a priest, then you can't get married, because now they're leaning more into that 1 Corinthians 7. It's better for the sake of ministry to not be married idea. And I believe this is still where the Eastern Orthodox Church is. If I have it right, I'm a little hazy on this, but in the Eastern Orthodox, I think it's once you're ordained, you're not allowed to be married, but you can get ordained while being married, and that's fine. However, I think you're prohibited from becoming a bishop in the Eastern Church if you're married. So if you're married, you can become a priest, but you can't go any higher in the ranks than priest. The bishops all have to be celibate, as far as I can tell. It's not until the 4th century that there's any kind of prohibition against clergy being married, but it doesn't really get enforced. So this is when the Roman Church says, okay, clergy is not allowed to be married, but they don't really do anything about it. It's on the books, but everything kind of carries on as it was before. As long as you're married before you're ordained, Rome doesn't really care. That's fine. It doesn't really get enforced until the end of the 11th century, when Gregory VII cracks down on married priests. So it's in 1075 when Gregory VII says, all right, I'm going to start enforcing this, and now all priests have to be celibate. And so they go into Germania, and they tell all the priests, all right, you all have to leave your wives now. You're not allowed to be married as priests anymore. And all the priests riot. It says that the archbishop who came to Germany to make this announcement had to go hole himself up in a church because they almost killed him in a mob because the men did not want to give up their wives. Go guys. So it's not until 1075 when Rome really enforces this idea, saying no one's allowed to be married. All current marriages of the clergy are now dissolved. So all of you women who thought you had nice family lives with the local priest, you're You're now unmarried sluts with bastard children. Ha ha ha. Sorry, language, but yeah, that's what Rome does. It just dissolves all the marriage. Any priest who will not disavow of his wife and family and say, oh, I guess I was never really married to you. Have fun with all of your illegitimate children while I go off and be a priest now. They would be imprisoned or executed for their crime of being married, which is weird. So in this crackdown from Gregory VII that now endures into the 1500s when the Reformation is happening, it says that means that we have something clearly ordained by God, which is marriage, which is also elevated to the level of sacrament in the Roman Church, which is now being undone for entirely extra-biblical doctrines with no authority behind it other than just Rome saying, well, we're Rome and we say so, and again, so 1 Timothy 4, 1 through 3, not only is forbidding of marriage a doctrine of demons, according to 1 Timothy 4, but now Rome is doing this step where they're killing people for the crime of remaining married and not disavowing their wives, which, again, what God has joined together, let no man separate. Rome is trying to separate, and people who don't go along with that are being executed. So now we make the case in the article, not only are you doing the doctrine of demons and forbidding marriage, but you're also killing people over it, which also makes you in the doctrine of demons, because what does Jesus say about Satan? He is a murderer from the beginning. So now Rome is murdering people for the crime of being married, which is just, we'd say, digging them deeper in that hole of being in the doctrine of demons. Everything meshing and gelling so far? Any questions? All right. So that's Article 23. Then Rome takes that and they write their confutation, and then we respond to it with Apology 23, and Rome's response is just bad. All right, so this is the quote from the confutation, or a quote from the confutation here. The Lutheran princes call celibacy an abuse, when the direct contrary, the violation of celibacy and the illicit transition into the married estate, deserves to be called the worst abuse among priests. And later on it states, the princes ought not to tolerate this, to the perpetual shame and disgrace of the Roman Empire, but rather should conform to the universal church and not be swayed by these suggestions. So that's Rome's objection to the priests being married, is that marriage produces shame and disgrace. Unmarried priests having secret families are apparently fine, but if they're married, that is shameful and disgraceful and just an embarrassment to everybody. And so again, we're making this point. Marriage is ordained by God. It's given to us by God. It's talked about highly throughout Scripture. How can that be a disgrace, especially when you compare to the debauchery that the Roman clergy has been engaging in throughout all of the ages, while pretending that they're better than everyone because they're celibate. They're not really celibate. They're just not getting married to the women that they are doing things with. And yet they're trying to set themselves up as like, oh, yes, we're better than you because we're perfectly celibate, so I won't acknowledge my children, and that makes me a better Christian than you, weak person who can't resist the urges and has to get married and stay devoted to one wife all his life. It's so disgusting and disgraceful that you would do that. That's their argument. So we're saying, Rome, you're the guys who are being shameful here. Not only are they deriding marriage, but they're also, again, they're demanding marriages be dissolved. They are torturing and killing men who do not leave their wives if they're clergy, which, again, so the women, best case scenario, the woman becomes a single mother with now illegitimate children because her husband leaves, or her husband gets killed, so now she's a complete widow and has no one to get any child support from. It's barbaric and disgraceful that they are doing this in the name of God. And we don't really realize this very much, but the Reformation really does elevate marriage in the eyes of Western society overall, because that's this view that celibacy is the higher calling has permeated everything where, marriage is kind of derided. Marriage is for those who are not strong enough to remain celibate. So if you get married, it's kind of like, oh, that's kind of a flaw in your character that you are not strong enough to be celibate. So go be married. I guess that's okay, but you're not as good as me. And it's really Luther getting married and then writing all of these books being like, oh, marriage is awesome. I love being a father. I love having children. Well, I don't know why anyone wouldn't want to be married. Like, my life was kind of pretty miserable when I didn't have Catherine here to help take care of me, because Catherine is awesome, guys. I love my wife so much. And so it's really Luther's writing on marriage that starts to elevate it into no, marriage is a good thing. Why would we ever deride marriage? We should want our kids to grow up and be married and have big families. Yeah, the Reformation doesn't just touch pure theological things, but it really does elevate the idea of marriage and the office of vocation and what it means to be a husband to your wife and a wife to your husband and all of these things. So Rome has had this history of kind of deriding marriage and getting everyone to look down on it as kind of the lesser option. It's the Reformation that starts to really bring it up kind of to the ideal we aspire to today. And like I said last week, maybe we've gone a little bit too far to now we have this wonderful American Christianity thing, whereas you're not really a full Christian until you're married. And again, we need to not look down on people who are single either. We need to get that balance going. But yeah, it was like this before. It's Luther who starts to get us to here, and now we've kind of gone too far the other way. But I'm rambling now. Am I still making sense? Okay. All right, so now we're going to go through Rome's going to restate some of our arguments, give Rome's response to them, and then our response to Rome, and then this is going to shift directly into Rome's arguments themselves. And again, Rome does not give great arguments. But all right, going back to our first statement, marriage is God's command. Again, Genesis 1. So I mentioned 127, God made man in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. So we have this complementarianism between male and female already. And then the next verse 28, and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So not only does God create man and woman for the sake of them being married, but then he tells them, be fruitful and multiply. Have kids. What is the only way to have kids within God's law? By being married to the other parent of those kids. So not only does God create marriage with his blessing, but he commands it in the beginning here. So therefore, quote, since this order of God cannot be suspended without an extraordinary act of God, it follows that the right to contract marriage cannot be removed by statutes or vows. So this is the language here this is the language that acknowledges that asexuality does exist and that it's fine. But it's saying the married order, this is kind of how we're designed, this is how we're programmed, is for men and women to get married and then be fruitful and multiply. And so this is the order of God, which cannot be suspended without an extraordinary act of God. So this is saying that extraordinary act of God is the people who don't have that desire within them. So that's the asexuality issue, where a person just doesn't have that desire for relations, and that's fine. They're not in a violation of God's command. If you're one of the 1% of the population who just lacks that desire, you don't have to force yourself into marriage in order to be still fulfilling the will of God. This is where the 1 Corinthians 7 thing applies. If you are able to, it's good for you to be single like I am. This is the Matthew 19 thing where Jesus says, yeah, it's better to not be married, but not everyone can actually receive this. So if you are one of those minority people who are asexual, you lack that desire, that is a gift from God that now you can dedicate yourself more fully to the ministry and not have to worry about a family distracting you from things. But that's only if you have that extraordinary act of God, if you have that different wiring that makes you able to remain celibate without those desires. For the other 99% of the population, I don't know the numbers for sure, but I'm guessing that's about what it is. For the other 99% of the population that just isn't wired that way, you're within that order of God given in the creation of the world, where you're supposed to find a mate and get married to them and then have kids and only do married things with that person that you're married to. For Rome to come up to this 99% of people and say, oh no, you have to force yourself to be like the 1%, even though that's not how God created you to be, and it's just not going to work out very well for you, that's when they're going outside of God's commands. Is that making sense? Um, so what's Rome's response to this very clear message kind of commanding marriage unless you're of that very small percentage that can endure without it? Well, the earth has been filled already. So we don't really need to continue to be fruitful and multiply and produce more people. So marriage can take a back burner now because we've got enough people. That's their argument. Um, Interestingly enough, I've heard that argument used to support gay marriage. I knew a lady, she was LCMS, she grew up LCMS her whole life, and then like 2 years ago, I guess, she switched over to ELCA, largely over the issue of homosexuality. And in the Facebook post she listed before she like unfriended, she unfriended me at least. I don't know if she unfriended everyone LCMS, but before she unfriended me, she like put up her defense for it all, and she's just like, well, yeah, the sixth commandment says you should have marriage for the sake of kids, but the earth is full already, so we don't need to have kids. So it's fine to create a intentionally sterile marriage now. And it's like, no. So I'm not saying that's where Rome is going with that argument, but it's just as bad an argument either way. So then we counter it by saying, God's command was also God gives the command to the earth as well to be fruitful and produce crops. We produce a lot of crops every year, but no one says, oh, well, we had a lot of crops this year. We harvested everything, so we don't need to grow anymore. It's an enduring command that continues on for each season or each generation. Every year we need more fruitfulness of the earth, and the earth continues to be fruitful. Therefore, this fertility command is continuous. It doesn't have an expiration date. It doesn't have a set time to the earth when we're going to reach our perfect population and then we're supposed to stop making more people. God's command is be fruitful and multiply. He commands it to the earth, and thanks be to God, it continues to produce crops so we can have food. And then that command applies to us, and it is continuous. It continues. God doesn't say be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth until you reach a population of 3 billion or 4 billion or whatever number you want to pick, and then you can stop. Marriage continues to be the command. That all make sense? Good? All right. Next argument. Human nature. So again, this is how God created us to be. He created man and female so that we can be in a complementarian relationship. Complementarian means we complete each other. This is part of why homosexual marriage doesn't work, because if it's the idea is that men and women balance each other. We have different strengths and, again, general trends. Broadly speaking, men tend to be a certain way. Broadly speaking, women tend to be a certain way. And we can kind of fill in each other's gaps, and we can help each other. That's why Eve is created, to be a helper to Adam. Whereas if you have two men together, you have both of the strengths, but you also have both of the weaknesses going on at the same time. They don't balance each other out. Everything gets exacerbated. Interesting note here, statistically speaking, the lesbians have the highest rate of domestic violence in their relationships. Because you have two women coming together and they just, catfight. There's not that balancing out of everything. Because again, broadly speaking, general trends, men are more likely to be the stoic ones who, we tend to have anger issues because that's testosterone for you. But we tend to be able to step back and cool off and look at things a bit more rationally. Women tend to be a lot more emotional, and when you don't get the stoic mindset to come in, the emotions just flare up and they go crazy. And so, it's like even, they're like 0.8% of the population, but they account for they have like a 40% domestic violence rate within their relationships or something like that. It's the highest likelihood of a domestic violence situation is in a lesbian relationship, because you're going outside of God's order. You're avoiding that complementarianism of male and female as we were designed to have. So because this is an immutable natural law according to God's design, we can't just throw marriage out the window by human law or human tradition or human reason the way that Rome is trying to do so. And this was a great quote, very prescient for our day and age. It says in Apology 23, written 1531, To say that marriage is no longer binding, as in Genesis 1:28, is as if to say formerly people were born with a sex and now they are not. Okay, so Melanchthon clearly knew something was going to come up. But yeah, this is how we're designed. Men and women desire each other, and we are meant to desire each other, leading us, again, it's that fire if you do it outside of marriage, but that desire leads us into marriage where the fire can be in the fireplace and everything can be controlled and it's to everyone's benefit. If it were not supposed to be that men and women would desire each other, then God wouldn't make us men and women. He would make us androgynous Ken dolls who just go about our days and are completely sterile. So as, quote from the Apology, as we said above, we are speaking not about concupiscence, which is sin, that is lust, the desire to create the forest fire instead of having it in the fireplace. So concupiscence is still sin, but we are speaking about that desire which they call natural affection, and which concupiscence has not removed from nature. Concupiscence inflames it so that now it rather needs an antidote. Marriage is necessary not only for the sake of procreation, but also as a remedy. These things are so clear and well established that they can in no way be refuted. So this is, concupiscence is the addiction to sin that we have as a result of original sin. So concupiscence perverts that natural desire between male and female, and that's what turns it into lust, and that's what leads into extramarital situations that cause all sorts of damages. And so then, as concupiscence twists marriage, marriage becomes not only this ordained natural order from God and the reason men and women have a desire for each other in the first place, but now marriage becomes the antidote to concupiscence. So again, it's natural to desire people of the opposite sex, but again, the marriage bed is that fireplace where the fire can be controlled. And so marriage becomes the remedy for concupiscence, because now I'm not running around with any woman I can get to say yes to me. I am staying loyal to my wife, and we make babies that way. This is getting awkward now. Sorry, I have a major in theater, so I don't necessarily have a shame filter. It's true. Yeah. Whereas again, what Rome is doing in throwing marriage out the window, this desire is still there, and they've gotten rid of that remedy, that antidote where they can have the fire in a contained place. And so now we're seeing all of these issues that we're writing about in the Augsburg Confession, that were written about by various people complaining about it, for the last 500 years or so. Because again, just saying, oh yes, I promise I will remain celibate, doesn't get rid of that fire. And again, now they don't have a right and good outlet for that desire. And so then that gives sin another foothold in their lives. It leads them into all kinds of perversions and the issues that Rome is dealing with then, the issues Rome is dealing with now. And again, caveat, it's not just Rome that deals with this. But they're not doing themselves any favors in their response to it either. And yeah, so like it says here, these things are so clear and well established, they can in no way be refuted, and Rome doesn't have any response to that. So yeah. Any questions on number 2 then, or comments? All right. Number 3, avoidance of sin. This is kind of that same thing. But again, 1 Corinthians 7, while it does advocate for celibacy, it commands marriage to those who are not fit for celibacy, again, so that sin can't have that foothold to increase their desire and draw them into sin. So again, yeah. Now, concerning the matters about which he wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this, I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So if you have that passionate burning, rather than just trying to deal with it and unnaturally suppress it so that it leads to greater sin because of how sin is able to inflame our natural lusts and inclinations, you should get married so that, again, you have that fireplace where the fire can go and everything can remain contained. Rome's response is they essentially say, well, you can't prove that priests are supposed to get married because priests can just dedicate themselves to prayer and hard work, and that will conquer all of their temptation. They could just channel all of that lust into working out in the garden, and that will fix everything. They can make themselves better. They can make themselves into the ones who have, again, this is the language of Paul, each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and not of another. And Rome is saying, well, we can force God to give us that gift by just dedicating ourselves extra hard to prayer. So we don't need to get married to have that fireplace. We can take care of it on our own. To which we respond, priests are humans. Paul is speaking to humanity in general. Every man should have his own wife. Not every man of the laity, but every man, as long as you're not one of those people who has that gift from God of asexuality and perfect chastity, you should have a wife so you have that fireplace. Moreover, again, the Matthew 19, this is where Jesus essentially says the same thing that Paul does. Matthew 19, verse 9, Jesus is cracking down on divorce. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And the disciple said to him, if such is the case of a man and his wife, it is better not to marry. But Jesus said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. Again, it's a special gift from God for you to be able to endure life as unmarried. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have been made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive it. So Jesus is not saying this is better for everyone, but only those who are able to receive it. So if our desire cannot be overcome by our own discipline, then Jesus says, then you don't have this special gift from God enabling you to live that way. So God's system of chastity is to institute marriage so that the desires can be acted out in a chaste way. Again, that's the fireplace. It's not to force everyone into a denial of this natural order that humanity was created with. So God says, all right, God doesn't say no one is allowed to have a fire ever. God says, here is a fireplace. Keep the fire in there, and it's to everyone's benefit. And that's for all of humanity. And last I checked, priests and monks and nuns are still human, even if they might think they're better than all of us. I'm going to do a tangent here because I've been talking about sin not getting a foothold, and there's a quote in the Augsburg Confession itself I forgot to address in that portion. Let me see if I can find it really quickly. Sorry, it's a good quote, and it addresses an interesting bit of doctrine. I just need to find it. Sorry, my mind jumped on a different path. I'm really bad at speed reading. Okay, Okay, I'm not finding it in my speed reading, but um, in the Augsburg Confession itself, there's a quote. It's something like, um, it's like, especially in these last days, as we fall even greater into darkness, we need to even more affirm marriage to avoid giving sin this foothold of the forced celibacy on the priest, or something like that. I forget the exact wording. That's why I was trying to look it up, so I'm not paraphrasing too much. But here we are. But this was a pretty common doctrine at the time of Reformation, and you can still have a lot of Lutherans who will hold to this today. Essentially, as we're all looking forward to the not yet realization of Revelation, at the same time, every day we are straying further and further from a loving God. So we have this idea that when Jesus is incarnate, that's the apostolic age. That's when God is most present with His creation in that sense. And so now, as we move on from that point in history, after Christ ascends into heaven and He's not bodily present with us here, basically it's this belief that civilization is just going to be on this continual downward trend as we get further and further and further from when God was present with us as Emmanuel in the incarnation. And basically saying, yeah, everything is just going to get worse until it finally gets better when Revelation happens. Kind of goes into our amillennial eschatology. But they bring it up here to say, basically they're saying, yeah, even if celibacy if celibacy were ever tenable for the clergy, it would have been back in the first century when we're still really close to that apostolic age and there's more holiness present, for lack of a better term. But as we're getting further and further and further away from that event, as the time when Jesus walked the earth in that way is getting further into the past, we are just, all of humanity is falling into further degeneracy and degeneration as we move away from when God is with us. And so it's even more important now that we do whatever we can to avoid giving sin any kind of foothold. And again, that's what this enforced celibacy is doing, is giving sin that foothold, because it's not getting rid of the desire, it's just getting rid of the fireplace where they can safely exercise that desire. And I want to bring this up because, again, this gets into our amillennial eschatology, because there is one viewpoint called postmillennial eschatology, which says that the major views of eschatology all fall around the 1,000 years mentioned in Revelation, and how literally you take that and when you think that happens. So postmillennials say that Jesus will return after a 1,000-year reign of progress. So postmillennial eschatology says that there's, basically there's going to be a great revival or reawakening. Christianity is going to grow, and human civilization is just going to progress and slowly get better over the course of 1,000 years, and then we'll hit our peak, and then Jesus comes and He brings us all to heaven. This was a really popular view in the 1800s because the world stuff was getting better, and everyone's like, oh, okay, we're in the millennium now. Life is just going to get better, and then Jesus is going to come back, and it's going to be awesome. And then World War I happened. And then everyone's like, oh, I guess we weren't getting as better as we thought. And so postmillennialism really dropped off the map after World War I, because people had a hard time reconciling how that could have happened when we were supposed to be getting to the cusp of human improvement before Jesus comes back. But from what I've seen on YouTube videos and stuff, postmillennialism is starting to have a resurgence in the American evangelical sphere. So just wanted to bring that up so you're aware of that in case you run into that. But yeah, the more historical Lutheran view, and this is kind of where we still fall today, is no, as we get further and further away from Jesus' incarnation, stuff's just going to kind of get worse. Humanity's not going to improve very much. Look at the world today. Is it really that, culturally, are we better than we were in the 50s? I don't think so. We've had some improvements, but we've gone backwards in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, it's just going to kind of get worse. That's why we pray for Jesus to come back, because that's when things will finally get better. Kind of bleak, but there you go. Am I still making sense, or am I rambling? Okay. Lydia woke me up at 4 this morning. Sorry. All right, fourth argument then. Again, looking to history. Even the councils of church history have disagreed with this current practice. So looking at the councils of the early church, none of those mandated celibacy. The later councils would sort of mandate celibacy, but the way that they would practice it was if someone got married, they would remove them from the ministry. But even then, it wasn't. It was an honorable discharge. It wasn't a dishonorable discharge. It wasn't, oh, you broke the rules, so now you're a terrible person. You have to go be a lay person and sit in your shame. It was seen as an act of kindness, kind of recognizing the stresses that a minister has in his life, and saying, instead of you bringing all of the weight of your congregation home, and then your wife has to deal with it with you, we're going to release you from your ordination vow so you can go be a lay person and be with your wife and not have all of that extra stress that ministry can have. So at worst, that was the worst thing that the early councils ever would mandate when it comes to priestly celibacy, is if someone gets married, if a priest gets married, just let them not be a priest so they can focus on their marriage more and not have that extra stressor in this life. They certainly were not torturing and killing priests for being married the way that Rome is now. And even then, even when they did have this practice of maybe we should let the priests out of the priesthood if they get married, they still allowed for marriage in certain circumstances. So looking at all the councils, none of them dissolved existing marriages the way that Rome does, which again, what God has joined, let man not separate. And so what we're seeing here is, as much as Rome is trying to make appeals to church tradition in how they're enforcing the decrees of the Pope, they are being very, very selective in which traditions actually apply and which ones don't. And we have a quote from Daniel. Daniel, here we go. Daniel 11:37. Daniel 11:37 says, "He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all." This is Daniel's prophecy of the Antichrist, and now he's going to rule the world, and we're making the case here. Hey, Rome, you're ignoring what came before. You're ignoring the counsels of the fathers. You're ignoring what God has said before. You are advocating yourself. You're magnifying yourself above all. You're making this grand declaration entirely upon your own authority, and we say so, and you're being very selective in what you'll actually appeal to, and you're twisting everything in order to enforce your will, which, according to Daniel 11, is making you the kingdom of the Antichrist. So again, this is another argument for why we'd say the seat of the Pope is the seat of the Antichrist. Rome's response to all of this was, well, no, you're just reading the councils wrong. The whole church has always said priests have to be celibate the way that we've been enforcing it. We're not the ones who are changing anything. You just need to reinterpret everything to fit with what we're saying now, and then it'll all make sense. Because that's how Rome always responds to their traditions and their council declarations whenever they do change everything. Rome does change its doctrines. They just insist that they never change anything, and they reinterpret what was said before. It's kind of the I'm going to get political here, sorry, but whenever we're dealing with stuff with the Constitution, you have the conservative side that says, the Constitution's a dead document. It was set to mean what it meant when it was written. And then you have the people who say, oh no, it's a living document. The words change. So the way that language is used today is how we should read what was read back then. So we can reinterpret what the Constitution says. The Second Amendment was only about muskets. The First Amendment was only about the printing press, not the internet. So we can just do whatever we want, throw the Constitution out the window. That's what Rome does. They say, oh no, we just reinterpret what was said before. So we're not disagreeing with what we said before, even though we're doing vastly different things now, because we can just reinterpret how the language is used, and now it means something else, because God would never let us actually commit an error. We're not mistaken about anything. This is just the way it's always been. You were just confused in what you read about the past. All right. We're about time, so I'm going to stop talking now, but did you have a hand up? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. And Peter advocates for that too. And yeah, first Peter, because yeah, First Peter, um, he's writing to pagans who have converted to Christianity, and so he's running into issues where a lot of times the wife converts to Christianity, the husband doesn't. And Peter's advice is, as long as your husband isn't like threatening you or abusing you, stay with him, show him the Christian life, and that might convert him. But yeah, like Peter advocates for maintaining the marriage, even if you've converted and your husband hasn't, so you're now married to a heretic. First Pope, everybody, thinks marriage is cool. Now here we are. But yeah, we'll deal with the Levitical priests being married. That comes up a couple of bullet points down. But yeah, Rome addresses it in a very weird way. But like, yeah, the Levitical priesthood of the Old Testament, they had to get married. Like you kind of weren't allowed to be single as a priest, because in the Old Testament, the job of priest was hereditary. You were born into that, because again, the tribe of Levi was given the care of the temple. So if you were a Levite, you were basically assigned to be an acolyte or a deacon for the rest of your life, because that was your role in the tribe, was you helped to take care of temple worship. And then within the tribe of Levi, it was only the descendants of Aaron who could be the actual priests. So, no, Billy the Benjaminite can't just wake up one day and say like, "Oh, I want to take vows and become a priest because that's something I want to adhere to." No, it's if you're the son of a priest, then you're going to be raised to become a priest, because that's how they got their priests. They had so yeah. If the Old Testament priesthood had to be celibate, they would have died off within a generation, and they wouldn't have had any priests anymore, which is going to make it really interesting when Rome tries to use the Levitical priesthood in order to justify their enforced celibacy, which is something they're going to do. We'll probably get into that next week. But unless there's any other questions or comments, we're at time, so I'll pray us out and then we can get ready for the service. So, any last feedback? All right. Yeah. Because yeah, like once Luther gets married, actually a large catechism gets written before he gets married, I think. But okay, yeah, I haven't read the large catechism on it in some time. But like, yeah, Luther was very protective about marriage already. Like again, that's one of the main reasons he didn't want to get married, was like, Rome's trying to kill me. I don't want to get married only to be executed and then leave my wife a widow with whatever children we might have. It takes a lot of convincing to get him to kind of allay those fears and get him to marry Catherine. And yeah, part of it was Catherine's insistence. I'm not going to marry anyone except you, Luther. So if you want to see me married, you'd better come to the altar with me. But then, yeah, once he gets married, he's like, marriage is awesome. And he writes all these wonderful things about marriage. And he's been a very big proponent of it all his whole life. But yeah, and then Rome has been kind of throwing marriage under the bus. Like now Rome has like marriage is awesome. You should get married. We just won't allow for the priests, because then we'd have to admit that we were wrong about something. But like, yeah, Rome has a much better view of marriage overall than they did at the time that this was being written. I'll talk about that more next week, because I have my theory for how it all plays out. I can't verify it. It's all just kind of stuff that happens in my own head. I haven't researched it super well, but I'll share it with you anyway, and we'll go from there. But we are at time now, so I'll pray us out, and then we'll get ready for the service. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of marriage. We thank you for loving spouses who can help us navigate our way through this world, and for the children that you bless our marriages with according to your will. We ask that you would watch over all people, watch over marriages, watch over those who are single and enjoy that lifestyle, that they may use that gift to serve you. And we ask that you would watch over those who are single and do not wish to be, that you would give them the patience to endure as they must until they might find that person you have set aside for them. Please help us all to raise loving families, that we may produce more fruit for your kingdom now and always. We ask these things in your name. Amen.